With Donald Trump now the clear GOP frontrunner, it's worth recalling how many journalists cavalierly dismissed his chances 8 months ago.
I think this is Donald Trump's biggest day, and he will be ignored from henceforth.
Well, Trump trounced the other candidates in New Hampshire this week, and his media haters were not exactly gracious. New York's Daily News, which called him dead clown walking after his second-place finish in Iowa, came back with Dawn of the Brain Dead, blaming the state's mindless zombies. And the Huffington Post had this red-type screamer: New Hampshire goes racist, sexist, xenophobic. Ariana's website sliming the state's voters. With the action shifting to this Saturday's South Carolina primary, with Chris Christie and Carly Fiorina dropping out, CBS's John Dickerson tried to pin down the candidates in last night's debate, and there were fisticuffs.
In 2008, in an interview with Wolf Blitzer talking about President George W. Bush's conduct of the war, you said you were surprised that Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi didn't try to impeach him. You said, quote, which personally I think would have been a wonderful thing.
First of all, I have to say, as a businessman, I get along with everybody.
I am sick and tired of him going after my family. My dad is the greatest man alive in my mind.
Joining us now to analyze that campaign coverage, Heidi Presbella, senior political correspondent at USA Today. Juliana Glover, a consultant and commentator who worked in the White House for George W. Bush and Dick Cheney. And Simon Rosenberg, president of the New Democratic Network. So I'm looking at some of the headlines about the debate, Heidi. Slate, Donald Trump turned the GOP debate into a cage match. Politico, Trump bludgeoned a nasty GOP debate. Washington Post, Chris Salita, Trump a loser. Is it reflecting the fact that many in the media have just been waiting for a chance to attack Donald Trump?
Well, think about what the whole narrative has been coming out of all of these debates from the beginning. It's been Jeb going in there and trying but utterly failing to defend himself. And so this time we saw a totally different Jeb. He's actually defending himself and going on the offense. New narrative. Everybody jumped all over that. And I don't know if it was completely fair as well, because just because Trump loses his cool doesn't necessarily mean that he loses it with his voters. His voters like that. That's been kind of his selling point from the beginning, is that he's angry, right?
Well, let's take a look at one of those angrier moments, Donald Trump and Ted Cruz, and we'll come back on the other side.
For most of his life, his policies have been very, very liberal. For most of his life, he has described himself as very pro-choice and as a supporter of partial birth abortion. Right now, today, as a candidate, he supports federal taxpayer funding for Planned Parenthood. I disagree with him on that. That's a matter of principle, and I'll tell you.
You are the single biggest liar. You probably are worse than Jeb Bush. You are the single biggest liar.
All right.
This guy lied. Let me just tell you, this guy lied about Ben Carson when he took votes away from Ben Carson in Iowa, and he just continues.
A lot of boos there from the partisan crowd. Juliana, it occurs to me this is not the first time Donald Trump has had a debate where much of the press said he did terribly, and then?
And then, well, first of all, let's make this clear. This is South Carolina, where they're fighting over who's going to win South Carolina right now. Everybody knew expectations going into South Carolina was this was going to be a bloodbath. All of the various strategists made clear that it was going to get ugly, and indeed, it did last night. Interestingly enough, Trump said, again, another fabrication, talking about, no, he hadn't said that he didn't support taxpayer funding for Planned Parenthood. He's done that so many times. And what's interesting to me, this is a show about media, there's not been a clear catalog yet as to how many times Trump has been proven to be untruthful, dead to rights. You've got China, his suggestion to the New York Times that he would slap a 30% tax on 30% tariff. You have McCain calling him a loser. These are instances where I think you can go through and catalog this much more carefully and brightly and have it clearly understood that Trump has seriously challenged when it comes to being frank and honest.
What surprised me, Simon, was Trump, who ended up talking about George W. Bush in 9/11, saying that the Bush administration lied and knew that there were weapons of mass destruction. And certainly that there were no weapons of mass destruction, but whether it was a lie is the subject of a decade or more of political debate. So do you think the press being a little harsh on Trump here?
Well, what's interesting is, as you pointed out, that after almost every debate, the press has said he's done a terrible job, he's boorish, he swears, he's not fit to be president. And then there was one poll last night that showed him, coming in second place in terms of Republican voters. Look, he's got a very strong core of 25, 30, 35% now in every state. There's a poll out today in South Carolina has him over 40. And those folks have been staying with him every step of the way. The problem is, as Juliana alluded to, is the medium, the lane for the moderates, right, and the mainstream Republicans has been so divided now that he continues to roll ahead. So he had a good night last night. I don't think anything derailed him from winning South Carolina last night.
And of course, Trump is running against the media. He's running against National Review. Sometimes he runs against Fox. So the fact that various commentators and other geniuses, say he's gone too far in this, that, or the other statement or debate often seems to roll off him.
It seems to roll off him, and every single time we've called it, it's been because he does something that's maybe offensive to the general electorate. But this time, I think why people are seeing this as different is because he made some talking points that when, Juliana and I were talking about it beforehand, were actually Democratic talking points, arguably, going in there and going so aggressively against the Bushes, calling them liars in the war, and also defending Planned Parenthood. I mean, I think he even saw himself, whoa, I went a little bit too far here. Most of the work they do is, providing women's health services. But the abortion part, I'm really against that. But by that point, he had already been on the record defending Planned Parenthood. So I think the difference here was that if he did step over the line, and we see that in the polls, it wasn't because of his temperament, which is what we've all been calling it for. It was because he went over and veered into sounding more like a Democrat.
Before I move on, what do you make of the Huffington Post, for example, saying New Hampshire has gone racist and sexist because a majority of the Republican voters, not a majority, but plurality, voted for Donald Trump in this week's primary?
Well, Huffington Post has been on the record as very transparent that they're going to cover Donald Trump in a different way than the rest of the media. And in fact, they, until recently, were covering him in the entertainment section. Yeah. So I'm not at all surprised by it. I think for the demographic, that is mostly reading the Huffington Post, that's going to get a lot of clicks.
It's got a liberal audience, but I don't know. Blaming the voters seems to me to go too far. I want to turn to Marco Rubio because after the previous debate in New Hampshire, when he used the same scripted language and those exchanges with Chris Christie, got a lot of bad press. He started to do a lot of interviews, and here's one he did with ABC's John Carl.
And in hindsight, maybe that was a mistake. I shouldn't have done it that way because what it did is it moved me to a message that pivoted away from the question and kind of led to this perception that I tried to evade it.
Julia, I underestimated the impact of that bad debate on Rubio, but on the other hand, he had 3 days of just being called every name in the book by much of the press, and how much did that hurt him?
I think this week it hurt him very much. I think for the debate itself that we just had last night, I think he did a pretty good job. But the coverage so far out of that debate has been Rubio didn't get tackled. Going into that debate, Rubio needed to do some tackling. He didn't just need to sort of do a good job. He needed to go beyond and above that, certainly.
Isn't it an interesting, Simon, Marco Rubio held a 45-minute press conference on his plane. He's giving a lot of interviews that when these candidates get into trouble, suddenly their accessibility to the journalists who follow them around opens up because then they feel like they need the press to get a message out.
Yeah, well, clearly Rubio completely changed his strategy. He had a devastating day, through that debate. I mean, he could have won New Hampshire. I mean, he was on a trajectory to potentially win. So he really blew it. Look, these debates have been very consequential in this election. I think in terms of media, right, these debates have played a major role. TV ads haven't had as big a role. I think one of the things we have to learn and take away is that, these debates really matter. And Trump, for example, right, people make fun of Trump, but he's interesting, he's entertaining, right? That's part of politics. Like, we can't dismiss that. These other politicians, many of them are boring, right? And so Trump has really been able to redefine, I think, the terms of a presidential candidate in a digital and media age.
Rubio especially, just because some of his strongest moments have been debates. Those have been the things that he's been praised for.
Kind of elevated him from the middle of the pack.
So for him to stumble in a debate
I want
contest.
to close by talking about the breaking news last night, the death of Antonin Scalia at 79, Supreme Court Justice, who was a leader of the conservative wing of the court and was a major public figure. I found it disturbing just following this on Twitter. 20 minutes after we all learned that he had died, this debate broke out about, would President Obama get a chance to replace him? Would the Republican-controlled Senate block that? What were your thoughts about that?
My thoughts were that certainly there's been public figures who've died in the age of social media, but none that would be this consequential in the context of such a heated presidential election. And so this really was a social media phenomenon. It wasn't necessarily the mainstream news organizations all of a sudden pushing out, fully formed articles. It was people like David Axelrod saying, this is earth-shattering. And so that kind of gets the cavalry going. And yeah, it was shocking that it would happen so quickly. I don't think we even know the cause of death yet. Usually at least you wait for that.
Right. The whole concept of a decent interval to reflect on his life, whether you agree with his opinions or not, just out the window. Your thoughts?
Yes, exactly. I mean, what I found fascinating and sort of troubling about the slow leak out that he had passed away, was that there were local news affiliates that broke the news first, and the national media circled around that for probably a good half hour, 45 minutes, trying to determine whether the local news outlets were right. We're talking about an ABC News affiliate in San Antonio, and people weren't necessarily going to believe it. And now I'm beginning to wonder, sort of, unless it happens and AP reports it, did it indeed happen at all?
In terms of that's a great point about who's trusted by other journalists. In terms of the political back and forth now, when Mitch McConnell came out and said the Senate's not going to vote on a nominee, can you tell me that if this was a Republican president, wouldn't conservative commentators say, of course, he should get his nominee? And if this was a Democratic-controlled Senate, liberal commentators would take the other side. This just seems like reflexive partisanship to me.
Well, in some ways, Howard, but you know, the truth is the controversial thing is what McConnell did, right? There's nothing controversial about the president saying, I have an obligation to fill a vacancy at the Supreme Court. I mean, this is part of what happens, has been going on for hundreds of years. The controversial thing, and the thing that caused the media storm last night and today, was Mitch McConnell not following a decent interval, jumping in with incredible politics last night and saying we're going to block this thing and we're not going to let it go through.
If it was Harry Reid who controlled the Senate and wasn't going to give George W. Bush a vote in his last year, would you be saying the same thing?
But that's not happened before. I mean, there is no precedent for what happened with Mitch McConnell last night in American history. And I mean, Mitch McConnell, we voted in Ronald Reagan's last year 97-0 to give him a final, which Mitch McConnell voted for and participated in. So the controversial part, McConnell should have waited and should have allowed there to be a decent interval, and I think he's the one who blew it last night.
Much more media coverage of this, I'm sure, in the week ahead, and I'll have